So to get started, we were wondering what the earliest creative writing piece that you remember actually crafting, and what you could tell us more about what it was about, if you could kind of go back in time.
Oh, so the question is, what is like my earliest poem I remember writing?
Poem or anything that feels like evocative to you that you remember, like, oh, I wrote that.
Oh, well, I had an amazing creative writing teacher in high school named Bill Brown, and I had 2 years of creative writing. And I get so sad now when I visit high schools because I'm realizing these programs are dwindling.
Mm.
Um, but he just gave us like the time, space, and permission to write. And I think for me, one of my earliest poetry memories is I remember the first day of creative writing class. I was 15 years old. And before he taught us anything, he was like, I want everyone to write a poem. And I remember thinking, like, I don't know how to write a poem. That's what I'm here for. And so we were all writing. He did this on purpose. And he stopped us about 20 minutes in and he said, how many of you are rhyming right now? And about a half the class raised their hand. And he said, do you know that you can write an amazing poem and you don't even have to rhyme? And I know that sounds really rudimentary to us now, but at 15, I was like, wait, what is he talking about? What is this other musical way of translating yourself? And so he started reading us like Li Young Lee and Sharon Olds and Ginsberg and Whitman. And I was like, whoa, what is this magical thing that's very musical, but it's not like these rich rhymes that you're used to hearing like in Hallmark cards or in Chaucer or even in Shakespeare. And he said, do you know that you can write an amazing poem? You don't have to rhyme, but he was like, all of your poems should follow a one, follow a metronome, have a click to it. And so he would often bring a metronome to class. And so I think I just have that one of those, the Oprah aha moments at 15 being like, oh, I can write in this lyrical way that's not Seussical, and it can kind of be part prose, part music, this other kind of magical, potent container. And I think, I don't know what I wrote that day, but I remember being like, oh, when someone gives you a sense of permission to do something, I was like, oh wow, like this deluge kind of happened for all my 15-year-old angst that I could flow out in this other way. And it was really powerful for me because at that time I wasn't really great in my other English classes. My English professors would always be like, Tiana, your essays are amazing content, but they're a mess. And it was as if poetry was always calling me to this form that I was like, oh, I can create my own form. I can create my own logic within a piece of writing. And that felt really powerful at 15 years old.
That's great. Now, do you have writing rituals? Do you have some of the same things that you do all the time to get it started?
Yeah, I'm trying to get more ritualistic. These rituals have been a new way, especially in the pandemic, to stay grounded. As time is so strange. So I think marking certain, you know, so lately I've been, sometimes I light a candle, sometimes I'll get a good affirmation, have affirmations like all around my desk. um, I'll get some good music going on because I think how you enter into the writing space is really important. I take notes every day. I'm not a writer that writes every day, but I take active notes every day. So I have tons of voice notes on my phone. I have tons of notes that I jot down. I'm always paying close attention to the world around me. And I think the key difference between an amateur and a professional writer is how do you follow up on those notes, and do you follow up on those notes? And so I think that's the difference for me, is that I think part of my ritual is going back on my notes, or in my writing process, I'm like, yes, like that tree that I saw the other day, I'm going to slip that into this poem.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the longest time, I used to really beat myself up because, I think fiction writers often have like, oh, I got to hit 2,000 words or 3,000 words a day. And I used to be like, man, I don't have that routine. And so part of my ritual is just, number one, use whatever works for you. And we all have different rhythms. Actually, in the pandemic, I've become more of a morning person. So I have a whole morning routine. It's called MMM, meditation, morning pages, a la Julia Cameron, and movement. And for me, I've really found, I always say that poems are bodies that remind us of our bodies. And so I really found that taking care of my body first really sets me up in my creative practice. And recently, I've really been trying to shirk and buck this idea that art should equal suffering. Like, I think that we've been fed this lie that you have to self-flagellate yourself to produce something greater. You have to enter your trauma and hurt yourself and re-exploit yourself to kind of bloodlet yourself. And especially as a Black woman artist, like, I just reject all that. And I think I fell under that myth. And a part of me is thinking, well, maybe it is a part of the process, and then overcoming that transcendence is a part of the process. But I'm trying to take better care of myself. And I have found and just really, I mean, even something as simple as drinking my water. I have a gratitude practice, and just entering into my body in that way helps me enter into my creative work with so much more energy and vitality. And I also just don't suffer through my work. If I'm struggling with a poem, or a poem's stuck for me, I stop and I'll go for a walk, or I'll go back to reading. Like, this process should feel good, you know? And I think so often we've been fed this like really romantic version that, like, you should, be hurting through your art. And again, I think that is maybe part of the process in the beginning, but I'm really trying to reprogram that for myself. And it's been really a healing journey for me. And my new work is reflecting that sense of joy and delight. I mean, I think Ross Gay is a great example of this, where you can't help but read his work and you feel the delight in his work. But that comes from, that the person has done that practice in their own life. You can't fabricate that type of joy. That comes from an inner place. And I think the writers I even pulled to, like a Gabrielle Cavacaresi or Ada Limon, or even a Maggie Smith is going to be at the conference. Like, these are writers where you can tell that I think they're taking care of themselves. And I think that's important.
Oh, wow. That's so great. You mentioned some of the writers that you look up to. I wonder if you might talk about some writers right now that you're reading. You mentioned kind of taking a break sometimes and just reading when you're stuck. So who are the people you're reading right now?
Right now, I've actually been reading a lot of Mary Oliver. I've been reading through her collected devotions. It's just been a really nice way to start my mornings. I think she's a morning poet, so it feels very, but I've actually read one of her other collections called like A Leaf in a Cloud, I think it's called, but it's a collection of her longer poems that I actually hadn't read before, and they're absolutely stunning. And I think she's a sneaky poet. I think a lot of people think she's a very simple poet, but I think when you enter her work, it's actually very masterful and wonderful. I reread Bluets recently by Maggie Nelson. I love texts that kind of enter into that hybrid space, and I think entering into Bluets, this obsessive text, looking at loneliness in the pandemic, was really interesting. Right now, I'm about to teach an ekphrastic class for Swanee this summer, and so I've been reading a lot of, rereading a lot of Natasha Trethewey and Ava Jordan and John Ashbery and Diane Seuss, and thinking about the text that I'm going to be entering into the ekphrastic space, and kind of, it's one of my favorite modes of poetic craft. And so I'm in that syllabus making mode of going back to those texts and plucking out things and techniques that I really want to teach this summer.
You mentioned reading a lot of poetry, but this question has to do with literary characters. What literary character do you wish were a real life person that you could have as a best friend, hang out with on your speed dial?
That's a great question. My mind went to Sula initially, and because I think Toni Morrison writes really amazing, complicated Black women, and I think Sula possesses this kind of like power and sway and mystery that I think is really interesting. I think there's parts of her that remind me of myself, or maybe parts of my disowned shadow that I don't want to confront. And her power over men, especially in just female friendships. So I think she'd be a very interesting, juicy person to have on speed dial to talk to. I think she would have a really fun perspective, and I think she would tell it to you straight, as Toni Morrison often does in her really clean, cutting, precise prose. So yeah.
That's a great character. I'm wondering too, with so much that we read and the writers that really matter a lot to us, I feel like we take some of their writing craft techniques and kind of absorb that into our own work. I wonder if you might talk about your work in the sense of how you approach editing or rewriting, kind of what your process is to craft the poem in the way in which you get across exactly what you're trying to say, and also who you might be in conversation with when you're editing. Do you have trusted readers? Do you just kind of do that on your own? So yeah, speak a little bit about your editing process or approach to editing.
I love this question. I mean, I think editing is where the hard, glorious work really happens. As you both are teachers, you both know, I think if anything, it's teaching is impressing upon students the importance of revision, because I think we live in this kind of one and done culture. Like I always can tell my students, I'm like, I know when you write that rum poem, you're like, oh, this is fire. And I'm like, no, 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 no. And I was an early student because I think you're it's a gift to even get it out on the page, right? But for me, I've really found the gift of revision. And it's this, I often think of Lorca's Duende, right? This mysterious force that no philosopher can explain. You always hope the Duende comes, but I think he talks about the Duende being this labor, right? Something that kind of you reckon and wrestle with on the page. And for me, the gift of revision is this intensity, this storm that kind of filters through you. And so for me, what often happens is that I have my little poetry and tonight out in the world, I'm paying close attention to the world, I'm collecting and taking notes, and then there's kind of like a deluge moment. Sometimes it's because of a deadline or something that happens. I mean, recently The Atlantic reached out to me for a poem, and they had a kind of a rough draft idea of what they wanted me to write. And so I'm holding that with the deadline in mind. And then I'm also holding on, I've been walking this loop around my house. There's a greenway near my house every day that I walk. And I found out recently that one of the deadliest American train wrecks in 1918 happened on that track, and you can actually like see the leftover train tracks. And I started doing this history, and it was actually over 100 African American people that died because they were headed to a munitions factory in Texas. And this is often how it happens for me, that like you're and tonight you're out, you're taking it. And also I have this app called Picture This where you can, I don't know if y'all seen it, where you can see what a plant is and it will tell you what it is. And so I've been collecting all these plants and trees, and then this like accident, and then like solicitation for the Atlantic, and they all converge together. And then, then that deluge moment happens. Then I'm obedient to it. And then I clear my schedule, and then I have to be obedient to the draft, and it's rumbling through me. But this day started with, I have a meditation group where we sat outside with our masks on, and I almost didn't go, but I was like, nope, meditation, it's part of my ritual. But it was so interesting, during my meditation, the poem started coming. And so what happens for me is I rushed home and the poem was already starting to come out, and I'm trying to just capture it. I think Ruth Stone talks about this. We're just trying to catch the hem of the piece as it's rumbling through the mountain. And so I decided to write the sestina, but I wanted to break the sestina as I was writing it. And so my mind gets really excited of like, okay, what are my 6 words? Okay, how am I wanting to subvert expectations? How am I talking about Black death and bringing history and weaving these pastoral glosses of what I've been collecting, and how am I reaching for Black joy and pleasure? And then I just get excited. And so I'm in that act of pure discovery. And then revision happens with like, now a different brain comes on, because in that first initial draft, I think it's my childlike self that I'm actually trying to encourage, of like chase and trust all your instincts, follow where you want to go. Then in my editing mind, it's kind of a different mode of, okay, where are you breaking the sestina and why? Or where did you, like, what are those considerations? Are they thoughtful? Where have you made a contract with the reader? And then where are you actively breaking that contract? And then where is that decision between risk and hokiness, or a risk that you're willing to take? And I think I'm going through all of those like checklists that we all have of like grammar, syntax, punctuation, where's the heart of the piece? I'm going through all those things in my mind. I print it out, I read it out loud, I'm editing by my breath, I'm listening to the language. Where is it getting stuck? Where am I stuck? And then I'm exhausting where all the surprises, where all the considerations, and when is this piece stopped revealing itself to me? I think also like letting my ego get out of the way and letting it reveal itself to me. And so I think sometimes that can be like an 8-hour process. I'm one of those writers, I can just like be inside of it for a long time. Sometimes I have to walk away from it. Sometimes sleep is the best editor. I always say, go to bed, Tiana, because sometimes you can edit the soul out of something because you're just being I'm very obsessive, and also the sestina is very obsessive. And so all that listing and twisting, sometimes I can get carried away. And so I always copy, paste, and push down, copy, paste, and push down. And usually my poetry documents are like anywhere from 100 to like 200 pages, because I'm pushing down and pushing down. But I also do that just in case I need to scroll back up. I'm like, okay, I lost something. I liked what I did, But recently I've been thinking about 2 considerations from other poets that I really like. I think Terrence Hayes always says that in his first draft, it's just him and his shadow. The audience isn't in the room. And I really like that idea, because I don't often think about audience until I get to revision, but that first draft, I don't think about anybody else. It really is a private exercising everything that's outside of me. I think if I thought about audience in that first draft, I would not write a lot, because I'm also trying to reveal something true or something hard to say or something that might be risky or difficult. And I think when you think about the audience person next to you, you wouldn't reveal that, right? I mean, as you probably both know, you probably reveal things in your work and like, damn, I don't know that I thought that. Or like, like, not that I'm trying to scare myself, but it's even just hard, to look at yourself in a mirror and say, I love you, or look at your mirror and reveal something to yourself. And so I think that first initial process is actually a private way of revealing some truths or some abstractions that you're trying to concretize in your work. And then I think Major Jackson just came out with that new poem on poets.org. I don't know if you saw it recently. It's like, let me begin again. And there's a line in there that stuck out to me. It said, reader, I should have married you sooner. And I was like, oh, this is an amazing line. And this idea that I took from it was that, like, I think we hold our reader with a lot of opacity, or like with a lot of psychic distance. And I love that line of like, reader, like, why didn't I invite you into this private intimacy sooner? For me, being vulnerable in my work and probing really personal landscapes to zoom out to a larger truth is always how I've entered the work. And so I like to think that I've held my reader in intimate ways, but I think I'm thinking about that a little bit more. I've been carrying that phrase with me with revision a lot.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, you mentioned teaching and Ruth Stone and Chasing a Poem and Terrence Hayes, and I'm wondering if you have what's the best advice a teacher has given you? Do you remember the great advice you got and when you were ready to receive it?
Yeah, I think that latter part of the question is the right when you're ready to receive it, right?
Yeah.
I was at Swanee Writers Conference working with Robert Hass, the amazing Robert Hass, and I was actually working on the Rhyme of Unison on the long poem in my collection. And I was in the middle of my MFA program. I was definitely one of those like people pleasing graduate students that was like, whatever my professor said, I did, and I changed. And I had this wonderful moment with him that I'll never forget. We had a private conference. And he's like, hey, he goes, I don't know about this line. I said, absolutely, I'll change it. I'm sorry, sir, I'm sorry. And he was like, I think he could tell. Whoa. He goes, whoa. He goes, hey, I'm just one person. And in my mind, I'm like, yeah, one Pulitzer Prize winning, like so many books. I will do whatever you say, Bob Hass. Like, and he was like, hey, I'm just one person. He's like, maybe read it to 3 or 4 people. And if they're also confused by this line, then maybe think about changing it, because there's an instinct that got you to this line. And maybe the instinct is not to cut it, but to actually lean into that instinct. And maybe this is just a placeholder. And he said, Tiana, you should trust and chase your imagination. And I was like, and that's been like such a guiding principle for me, because I think often the easy thing in workshop is to cut. But what if we leaned into our instincts? And I think that's I try to put that challenge to myself and also to my students in workshop, because I think that's such an easy workshop muscle to be like, cut it, or well, but actually it's like, what is the instinct that got you to this place, and let's talk about that. And that was such an eye. And then he put the seat of what's the word I say, just like back on myself, my own agency in my own work, instead of constantly searching for like even your heroes or your professors or even your workshop cohort to guide your work. That at the end of the day, it's to me, you were the CEO of your imagination. And that was a really empowering moment for me. I was like, I am responsible for the decisions in my work. And I need to be careful of, yes, I will take advice and critique. But he kind of gave me back that power and agency, and I never forgot that moment. And I often try to teach that to my students. My whole pedagogical approach is decentering authority. And I want to empower my students to even argue and dialogue with me. And that even just because I'm your professor doesn't mean you should always take my advice. I view everything as a conversation and a suggestion of making you just think about considerations. But I always make my students write revision statements at the end of their semester, because I'm wanting to see how they're thinking through the poem. I said, I'm grading you on revision. I'm not grading you on the talent of your work, but I want you to defend all of your choices and decisions to me. And that's where I feel like that moment taught me to do that for myself. And then that's how I teach as well.
Oh, that was right in line with the question I was going to ask you, which was kind of what you as a writer get out of teaching classes or facilitating workshops? And I guess kind of the second point to that is, what key element do you feel like really would make a workshop successful, or how you might determine the success of a workshop?
These questions are so good. I come from a long line of teachers in my profession and my DNA, so I feel like it's very, very innate. I learned I want to be a forever student. I don't ever want to master anything. So I think for me, I feel so incredibly grateful and lucky to be a student. This is an incredible privilege that I have to teach what I love. Every day I'm like, I get to teach, write, love, read what I do for a living. And so for me, it keeps me a student, and the institutional support that you get as a writer is just absolutely incredible. Like access to digital libraries and to real libraries and to archives, and to be a forever student. So I've taught Ross Gay's catalog on Vash Gratitude for the past 5 years. I teach it every time I can get. And then so to your question of what I like being a teacher is, even though I've read that book a million times, every semester a student unlocks something new about a poem for me. And I love that moment that even as a teacher, I'm like, I just learned something new about this poem that I've read so many times, and I never get tired of it. I never get tired of it. And I love talking about it. And I love seeing that growth and development to give a student that time, space, and permission to write. Or when I see that moment happen, I'm like, oh, a poem can do that. Oh, I can have the permission to do that. And it's the same permission that I'm giving myself. And it's like we're learning and having this synergy together. And so I just, for me, it's such a gift to be in that place to show students the possibilities, right? Emily Dickinson, I draw on the possibilities within poems. And then it reminds me of that possible. And I think it keeps me, so often I think in the creative world, you can get so solipsistic and sucked into your own, am I allowed to cuss? It's sucked into your own bullshit. Well, this is sucked into your own bullshit. And I think that when you teach, I think it brings back something that's kind of really pure and what it's all about. And it keeps me like that. We're all just nerds and geeks about lines and craft. And like, I get like this kind of Fraggle Rock, Miss Frizzle kind of vibe when I'm teaching, and I can enter that space. I remember when I first started teaching, I was trying to be what I thought a professor should be. And I hit all these roadblocks, and then I just stopped and I started being myself. And I found out that like my students fell in love with my weird idiosyncratic ways, and I would get really excited and flustered about a poem. And then it allowed them to be vulnerable and weird and excited about what they were doing. And so for me, teaching holds that same place as a poem of, I'm trying to be as brave as my poems. I'm trying to be as honest as my poems. It's the same thing in the classroom. I'm trying to be brave and honest and vulnerable. I'm trying to model the things that I'm teaching for them because I want them to enter that space. And I kind of reject sometimes that erudite way that certain, professors I had growing up that were like, this is how you read the text. And I would feel so afraid to share my opinion after reading something. And I really want my classrooms to feel open and safe. And then about workshop, I think it's really important that workshop is a voice, but not the voice. And I'm really interested in kind of blowing up the idea of the workshop from the IO Writers Workshop and this idea that you should remain silent. I think especially as a student of color, I think that's really problematic that you're supposed to be erased in the space and then people can talk about your work in a way that can be really problematic. And so I always tell my students at any point that you want to talk, if you feel that we're in the wrong direction, if you feel that you are not safe, you are allowed to speak in this space and say no more. And I think that's really, really important because obviously I get why we have that because it's so easy to be defensive of your work. But I think it's important to, again, to encourage students to have their own agency. And I say all the time, if we're beating a point that you don't want us to talk about, let's move on. You can tell us to move on. I'm also interested in encouraging people that it doesn't matter what you want for someone else's work. It matters what they want their work to do. And then how can we encourage and make that happen? I always tell my students, I'm also trying to find better language also with workshop vernacular of like, I like this or I don't like that. Like that language to me is really lazy. And I fall into it very easily as well. And so how do you, and Robert Hass did this too in Swanee, he was like, he's like, let's go back to wonder. Let's go back to why we go to writing to begin with. And he was like, when we enter these pieces, he's like, let's talk about what's working first. And let's enter into like our imaginations and our fascinations. Because I think it's so easy kind of like what's not working, what's not. So a lot of the times I like to start workshop with, and I don't want a workshop to be so like it's a small world after all, Disney World, but I do believe like what's working, or what did you like, or what did it pique in you, or what questions did it bring up for you? So I think that's important to enter that space. And then I always enter like, what are our suggestions? And that no one is an expert. What are our suggestions? And then I often go back to the student. I'm like, what question? I always make every one of my students have questions of everything that's up for workshop. And then what can we address that are your concerns? Again, giving them back agency to how to end the workshop is what's important to me.
So with all these things, you mentioned Poetry Month and teaching, and how do you balance all these deadlines? How do you keep your writing central?
Oh, Bob. I'm sure I'm like, oh my God, gosh, how honest do I be? Um, it's something that I'm actively negotiating. I was actually just having a conversation with myself, because I'll be very raw. I mean, a lot of people are asking me for blurbs right now, and it's really hard because I want to be so giving and generous. And then I was asking myself, I'm delaying on saying no to someone right now because I think I'm afraid to say no to them. But I'm also like, where am I not taking care of myself? And so again, going back to my body, back to my needs. And it's hard sometimes. Like I live a very grateful life. I'm so excited for all the opportunities coming my way, but I also have to take care of myself and my deadlines. And so it's important. My guiding thing has been, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no. And that there's something, and I also want to operate out of abundance and not lack, which I think is a space of scarcity, that I think if you grew up poor or grew up in the margins can be sometimes an instinct. And so I'm trying to be honest with my time, and honor my own work and honor the things that I've agreed to say yes to. But there's ways that I fail at it every day, and there's lessons that I'm learning all the time. I'm trying to be realistic about what I can do in my own boundaries. As you can tell, I'm actively
Yeah.
I'm actively dealing with this because I want to do all the things. I want to be all the things, but I realize like I can do a few things really, really well, or I can do a lot of things in a mediocre way, and I don't want to live my life that way. And so I'm trying to be honest about my time and what I'm able to do. I'll never forget this. I saw Elizabeth Gilbert at a reading here in Nashville that she did with Parnassus Books. And this is way before the pandemic, but she was like, I'm not going to sign your books or do a book signing line. She's like, what I did is I sat in a warehouse for 3 days and signed over like 10,000 books. And she was like, I did this because every time I go on book tour, I always get sick and I'm out for like months. She's like, what we're going to do, she's like, but I did want to do a community thing together. She's like, we're going to sing Rocky Top together. But she's like, what I want to invite you to do is, were you not saying no in your life to something that you're afraid? Because like she's like, I was afraid if I did this that you guys would hate me, that you guys wouldn't love me. Like, oh, who does she think she is? But she was like, where are you not saying no in your life? And I was like, yes, I love this, because I often find when you protect your own boundaries, and it inspires people to protect their own too. And so I am learning and failing and realizing and making mistakes and lessons through that, and trying my best to honor the deadlines that are my schedule ahead of me. But yeah, if anyone, Bob, El Renee, if you have lessons, tips, please help me.
I'm learning from you.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Everything
the
you've
same
said.
thing.
I'm about to go change everything about my life.
Yeah,
So
it's
true.
difficult because I think one thing, I think when you're a writer, you're at a professor, you realize that basically you have homework for the rest of your life and deadlines. And I like it too because the deadlines often push and help us, and sometimes I siphon things out. I mean, I wrote an essay about Black burnout from a tweet, but they wanted the essay in like 3 days. I basically burned out writing the essay, and I was like, but this is a good story too. I actually got approached by a lot of literary agents from that essay, and I had a lot of good friends in my life that said, Tiana, you don't have to write this book if you don't want to. And I had all this shine and appeal, and my ego was being like pulled of like, oh, all these great agents want me to write this book. But I realized, I asked myself this question. I said, I think that all that I had to say with Black Burnout was an essay. I didn't want to stretch it out into a book just because I could, or just because an agent was asking me for a book from it. And that's what I'm learning, is that where do I honor myself and my decisions? And knowing that like I have many books inside of me, and just because I missed that opportunity because agent X, Y, or Z was interested, that like I know that I will have something greater in the future that I will be excited about and want to sell, and that's where I want to devote my energy and time to. And so I think in the poetry world, especially, like, we don't know how to advocate for ourselves. And especially as a woman of color, it can be really hard to advocate for yourself and ask for what you need. I recently, I've negotiated my honorariums and like have just basically been very honest with certain organizations, and it has felt very empowering for me to do that. And so I'm learning as I'm growing. Yeah.
This gives me chills. I was like, man, I knew I was going to get some words of wisdom from you, Tiana, today, but I'm like, oh, this feels really, really important. How we take care of ourselves and how we show up for ourselves in the world, and not just in the writing world, right? So I guess we'll close with a little bit of joy, or a little bit to look forward to after we're kind of emerging on the post-COVID-19 landscape. I feel like we're getting closer to that. Where would you like to go when you can just travel freely to recharge and to take care of yourself? What is your post-COVID-19 first place destination?
I want to go to the beach. I miss the beach. I love the sound of water, being by water. It's very magical and mercurial, and I love the beach, and I haven't been. I want to sink my toes in the sand and just read and just be out there all day and have sand in all my crevices, and and for me, the water is so essential, I think, to everything that I'm talking about around of manifesting, but also releasing and letting go. Manifesting, releasing, letting go. Conjuring, but also like just that release. And so water and the beach, the first place you'll find me as soon as I can get there, is in a big beach hat with a book in the sand by the water, for sure.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Amazing.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate you taking time out to talk with us. We're so excited that you can be with us at IUWC. It's just going to be a beautiful week.
Yeah, well,
thank you so much. It's great to meet you here in this space.
Yes, thank you, Bob. I appreciate your really thoughtful questions, and just thank you so much for having me again. I'm really grateful. So I'm really excited for the week. Yeah.
Thank you.